Okay, so for those of you online, this is a photo of me wearing some elephant pants, being told we had 48 hours to leave the Philippines because this was March 2020 and COVID had finally reached the shore of the Philippines. The problem with being told to leave within 48 hours when you're a day and a half away is you have to move quite quickly. So the next morning, we got on a very quick bus to Tagaytay, this little town which had now sold out of toilet paper, same as the rest of the world, it seems. And we boarded an internal flight to Manila. We got to Manila Airport. It looked a bit like this, and we managed to get on one of the last flights out of the country. Why am I telling you this? What on earth does this have to do with sustainability? I'm telling you this because COVID was like a bit of a line in the sand for quite a lot of us, a lot of changes in a lot of people's lives. To me, this marked the point in my career where I started to officially move away from just making buildings stand up and try and move into sustainability and try and change my career into doing this sort of stuff for a living. And to give you the context to that, we have to go back a few steps. So I started work at Arup back in 2010, I think, according to the timeline. And sustainability didn't really feature in my workload all that much. I wanted to work on cool projects all over the world. I wanted to work with architects, get fat pens out and spend days designing things. I liked high-tech architecture because I wanted the structure to be shown off because, a bit of an ego thing, isn't it? It's good fun. And I remember, this makes me cringe to say, but I remember in my interview talking about wanting to work on sexy buildings when I went to be interviewed for Arup. Somehow they hired me. And I started working on stuff like this that you see on the screen. And it took probably 3 or 4 years before I realized I wanted to do something with a bit more substance in it than just big, wavy, shiny glass things. And by the time I was sort of halfway into my time there, I was starting to talk about people and place and stuff that changed the profession and trying to try out new technology. And I started to hone in on wanting to work on projects that made a difference, sort of shifted the dial a bit, either in terms of the people who use them or the way we work as structural engineers or the way my team was working within Arup. I wanted to do stuff that would help be quite useful. I remember telling my boss that I point blank refused to work on the luxury apartment scheme that we just landed because, it was an investment thing and they were going to stay empty and I wasn't going to waste my time doing it, which didn't go down that well, but he did relent. And so I went through, the better part of 5 years pursuing projects like this. And it sort of culminated when I got the opportunity to go and work on the design of a university in a tiny country in the middle of Africa called Rwanda. This is the campus that at the time was just a series of renders, but that's a photo. The project was the Rwanda Institute for Conservation Agriculture. It was about 60 buildings. It's about 200,000 square foot of accommodation and teaching space. And it's on a sort of 3,500 hectare campus down in the south of the country. I was attracted to this because of the scale of the project, getting to travel. I got to go and live in the middle of Africa for a year. That sounded like fun. I was going to work with this local engineering team, 10 engineers. I was going to be able to sort of take my knowledge from what I'd done at Arup over the last decade, and I was going to be able to learn from them about how the hell you pull stuff like this off in the middle of nowhere, which is something that I'd never tried to do before, working in places like London. And that attracted me to it. I didn't go out there because of the sustainability credentials of the project, but pretty much as soon as I landed on the job, I discovered that what Master Design Group, the architecture firm who were leading on this, what they were trying to do was way in advance anything else that was going on in the office that I'd been based in Arup at the time. The purpose of this project was already pretty sustainable, right? You had a client who wanted to build a conservation agriculture university so that the country's population, which was set to double over the next couple of decades, wouldn't run out of food. They could be resilient as a country. That's a pretty useful thing to do. You could end it there, you could deliver it on time and on budget and be done with it. But the architects wanted to go further. And the question was, how can we make it as sustainable as possible? So this is a project built out of earth walls, timber roofs, stone foundations, none of which are very well suited to a seismic zone, for record, but all of which just made the whole thing more challenging and more exciting. And by the way, these are not mud huts, right? So from the first time I got sent some sort of architecture renders and some of this stuff, it was clear that they want to do something really bold. And it's also, in my opinion, high-tech architecture still. Structure's still on show. Look at those movement joints above that door in that middle picture. It's awesome, right? But the palette of materials that we were working with, despite being a pain in the arse, frankly, from a design point of view, meant that this project was about as low impact as you could get. I checked this morning, and if I remembered correctly, the carbon footprint of this whole campus, if you sort of average it, came out at 214 kilograms of carbon per square metre for all disciplines, all in, upon carbon. Absolute fraction of business as usual, about a sort of third of what we'd consider standard in the UK for an education project. And of course, being the size of campus that it is, the landscape team has since sort of planted trees and stuff over the rest of it. And by the mid 2030s, it's expected to be carbon negative. So it's a pretty one-off sort of exemplar. And I finished that secondment and I flew back to the UK to start working my next job. And I just felt like there was something wrong with the way we were doing buildings back in the UK, back in our London design office. Because if you, in the middle of nowhere, you could do 214 kilos of carbon per square metre, and you get back home and the best you can achieve is 700 or maybe 650 if you get, the clients buying some crazy ideas. It just felt like there was a disconnect there. And I started talking a lot at that point in time about, an extra P to go alongside my places and people and profession type stuff. I started talking about planets as well. And I started talking about the UN SDGs, which had featured a lot in this. And I started insisting that on the work I did, we talked about embodied carbon, much to the annoyance of the architects sometimes, who frankly didn't want to know. It had PVs on the roof, get on with it, make it stand up. This was quite a good period in time to be starting to talk about these things, because this was 2019. So this was the year of school strikes, the year of Greta Thunberg, as it's now known in the Chinese calendar, I believe. And this was the world starting to wake up to climate change in the mainstream, right? Lots of, probably you lot, have been talking about this for a long time before 2019. But me and the rest of us sort of Luddites were just starting to realise maybe there was something wrong with all this. And in the UK, there was a whole bunch of people in the built environment trying to do something different, trying to shake up the industry in the middle of 2019, trying to get on the back of the sort of school strikes and that momentum and change the way we did things. You might have heard of Built Environment Declares, you might not have done. Google it afterwards if you get a chance. It's a sort of umbrella declaration that within it, there's an architects declare, a structural engineers declare, and so on. And these declarations are being set up with the aim of getting firms to commit to doing something entirely different. It's sort of making the point, making people wake up to the fact that as a building designer, you're responsible for, a few thousand tons of carbon per year through your designs and your specs. The fact that a major building project would emit 500,000 tons of carbon into the atmosphere, and the fact that, taking your own cup to Starbucks wasn't really going to cut it in comparison to all of that. And I'd been blabbing on about the SDGs now for long enough that I was asked if I would give a presentation on them to the Institution of Structural Engineers and to their board and their council, who at the time I wasn't really doing anything with. I didn't know very much about them, but I knew somebody who was on their board who said, "You know about SDGs, don't you? Do you want to come and talk to us?" And I kind of said, "Well, no, not really. I don't actually know that much at all, but I can see what I can do." So I spoke around all the people in Arup who did know, and I pulled together this talk about the SDGs. And once I started to get into it and started speaking to these people in the know, it became clear that actually as an institution, the idea that we needed to focus all our effort across all 17 sustainable development goals was actually a bit silly, because there's one right in the middle of it at number 13 that we weren't really tackling as an institution. And of course, that's the climate action SDG. And there had been people for years trying to get some momentum on this, but not on the level of what was being required, not on the level of what the IPCC report that came out in 2018 said about rapid transformational change across every walk of life. So I wrote this presentation. I got people to critique it, and we went through it quite a lot of times before it's sort of ready. And when I gave this in July 2019 to the institution's board and council, I think it sort of represented a bit of a tipping point. By this point, there was enough people sort of pushing at this door, trying to push this institution to do something, that when you got this bearded young guy stand up on stage and say, "I don't really know anything about sustainability, but I think we should probably do something about this," that door broke open. And in that workshop, off the back of this, the board and the council sat to one side and they said, "We need to treat this seriously." And they passed this mandate that sustainability would from now on be treated the same as safety, which has always been the sort of number one tenet of the institution. And that's what sort of kick-started everything at the institution. That was a really exciting time. That was something that I probably should have stuck around to see. But instead of doing that, I then bugging off to go and travel around the world. I had a 10-month sabbatical booked, and I actually gave that talk on the first day of my sabbatical. So I felt kind of sad to disappear, just as everyone was going, yeah, let's do something about it. But as my boss said at the time, he was like, if we've sold this in 10 months' time, then you should be happy, right? You shouldn't worry that you missed out on it. And that is how I ended up in the middle of the Philippines when COVID hit. And that is why, when I then came back to the UK with a bit of a bump, and had to move into my in-laws' spare bedroom somewhere in the middle of nowhere in England, without a job, because of course the industry was up in arms, so nobody was going to hire you at this point in time. That was why I then started saying, well, hang on, maybe I could do something about this sustainability thing. So yeah, I was in the middle of a county called Leicestershire, which you've probably never heard of, but it's about 2 hours drive north of London, which in the UK, by the way, is a really long way. I know you guys think nothing of it. We think quite seriously about doing something like that. You get supplies and all of that before you set off. So it's in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of England. And I rang up an engineer called Mike Cook, who is the ex-chairman of Buro Happold engineering firm. Mike had been the one who set up Structural Engineers Declare, that slide with the big red sun on it. He had got that declaration kicked off alongside his colleagues who were doing the Architects Declare and so on. And he had LinkedIn me whilst I was, I think, in the middle of a camper van trip across New Zealand. Sent me a LinkedIn message saying, are you going to be in Arup tomorrow? I'd like to get a coffee with you in the morning so we can talk about your presentation you gave at the ISRC. And I had sort of awkwardly texted back saying, it's actually the middle of the night here and I just had quite a bit of beer and in the morning I'm just going to go hike up a mountain, but maybe in June, if that's okay. So I could ring him up now and I could say, I'm back in the country and I'm kind of bored and I want to do something useful. What do you want to do? And he'd been tasked with setting up this thing called the Climate Emergency Task Group. He'd been asked by the institution, will you set this thing up, share it, and work out how to make it effective at creating the sort of change we need to see within the institution to actually sort of get the ball rolling. And so over our sort of brief phone call on that Tuesday morning, we agreed that he would do the strategic stuff with the experience and the grey hairs, and I would go away and be all enthusiastic and try and actually, do the legwork to get stuff going. Also, because he still had a job at this point and had to go and win work and, deliver financially, and I just kind of didn't. I was sat having cups of tea in the garden at a time when you weren't even allowed out of your own house. So it kind of worked quite well as a sort of pairing. The first thing that we agreed we needed to do was to try and normalise sustainability within the profession. We said, there's no point having this as a niche subject on the side. If you're going to put this in the middle alongside safety, you need to somehow articulate that this is just a part of an engineer's life now, and that they, have to get on with it, because if they don't, they're going to be left behind. They can't win work. They can't hire anyone, and so on. That over in the middle. So this is our monthly magazine that goes out to members, goes out to all 30,000 members around the world, lands on their doorstep first of the month, every month. That cover in the middle, June 2020, is the first time it's been printed without a building or a structure on the front cover, much to the great annoyance of the people who wrote up some theatre in Rabat that month, who was featured inside across 8 pages and were expecting a nice architectural photo on the front cover, and then picked it up to discover there was an image of Earth, which in my opinion still shows their theatre, but you have to sort of zoom in quite far to be able to see it. This was the sort of kick-starting of us saying to the membership, this is going to happen now. We have had sustainable structural engineering articles in that magazine every single issue ever since, without fail. And at that point in time, when we announced it, we had a sort of standalone sustainability section. So you couldn't miss it. It was right up the front. Everything was green, partly because it's an ISRC colour, partly for the obvious reasons. And we started setting about writing all this guidance. Now, I didn't write any of it. Like I said, I didn't really know that much about this topic at that point in time. But my job was to go out and find people who did. So I spent the days on the phone trying to ring around all the big firms to find out which specialists they had who knew about circular economy or knew about low carbon design, and where all the carbon was hidden within a structure in the first place, to give you the quick tools towards reducing it and so on. And over time, we've sort of amassed this huge library of sustainability guidance. You can download this PDF from that QR code on the top left, and it's got about 200-ish links in it now to ISRC guidance on sustainable structural engineering. Almost all of which is free to our members and our affiliates, and about a quarter of it's free to non-members as well. So anything that's sort of like high-level stuff is free to anyone who wants it, because we realised that if you're going to sort of be able to speak to your clients and your collaborators, you kind of need to be able to share some of this stuff with them. So the agreement we managed to get from the financial team was we could give away some of it in certain circumstances. There's a zoomed in Bitterest in the top right corner for you. A really key bit within that was the stuff we did around carbon calculations. So up till this point in the UK, if you wanted to learn how to calculate carbon, there was some bits of guidance about all over the place, fine. But you needed carbon factors, and that was complicated to get hold of. And there were these things called EPDs that nobody really knew what to do with or where to get them from. And if you went and spoke to different sustainability specialists, they'd all give you a different answer when you said how much carbon's in my building. And when you asked them why it was different, they went, oh, well, we used a different tool to them. And none of them thought that was weird and we should do something about it. They all just kind of accepted it. So for us, there was a bit of a change when we wrote this guide on the left, because what we did was we said, these are the carbon factors you should use during concept design for the following materials. And here's the maths to follow on your way through. And it's, I mean, you all know it's like the simplest maths you could do. And when you write that down in a book, people go, oh, is that it? And you're like, yeah, that's it. Now do it for every building. And this put an end to people asking us what's more sustainable, steel or concrete, you know, that age-old question of which one is it? And you turn around and say, well, I don't know, do the maths. This enabled us to do it. And we released the guide in late 2020, and then we followed it up early the next year with the tool on the right, which is just an Excel spreadsheet that does the same thing. These are both free, again, by the way. So if any of you want them, please use them. We've had people translate the tool into French, based in Switzerland. You can embed your own carbon factors in the back. You can pull it apart. It's all open source and all that kind of thing. As a reminder, at this point, I was working pro bono, right? So this was me in my in-law's spare bedroom with minimal outgoings, except our sort of alcohol bill as a family, which was starting to get carried away. But except for that, we weren't really doing much with our time. So that was working quite well. But my sabbatical was now formally coming to an end. Arup were expecting me back in the start of July. And Mike Cook and I were sat there on the phone going, this isn't going to work, isn't it? Because I was not going to be able to spend 3 days of my weekend every week doing this. It wasn't going to work. So he and the iStruct chief executive and my boss at Arup, a guy called Ed Clark, had a phone call between them and agreed that the iStruct could have me 2.5 days a week if Arup could have me for the other 2.5. Which, as any of you who have had multiple projects on the go at once would know, that what they actually meant was you can have him for 4 days and we'll have him for 4 days and he'll work it out, right? So I entered this period of working quite a lot of days per week, trying to balance the two. But it meant that I could do this stuff on work time. I could actually get paid for it, which was quite nice. And it enabled me and my wife to finally move out of the in-laws and move into our own place and work like professionals, which is all good. And by the end of 2020, it had become clear that 2.5 days a week at the iStruct could easily become 5. There was so much work to do on this. We could all see it. The chief exec could see it, and I was really keen to do that. So we sat down, had another chat, and I left Arup at the end of January 2021, which I never thought I would do actually. And I was there for just over 10 years. And the rumor is, after 10 years, you're more likely to retire than resign at Arup. It's that kind of place. So I got out just in time, it seems. So I moved to the institution full time. I was now reporting directly to the chief exec, who said that he wanted this to be a sort of cross-institution thing. So he would be my boss to start with. That lasted about a year till he was sick of the paperwork and signing off all my requirements for holidays and stuff like that. And then we had a sort of dual reporting role where he could do the policy bit and somebody else could do the logistics. But I was then able to sort of like start working with the staff and working across the institution. And some of the later changes we've made have been on an even sort of deeper level. So all that guidance is great, but it's all optional. As of this year, to become a chartered structural engineer with us, you need to be carbon literate. So you have this interview that tests you on certain competencies. As of summer this year, it will include being able to calculate, reduce, and communicate embodied carbon. Ideally, you can do reuse of existing buildings, and that in time will become mandatory. I'm pretty sure of that. It's a case of when rather than if. And just remember, we have a global membership, so we kind of have to account for where you set the bar for engineers in Malaysia as well as Manchester, which makes it a bit more complicated. And as of next year, the second part of our membership requirements, which is this exam, some of you might have heard of, where you design 2 buildings in 7 hours, nightmare. You're now going to design 2 buildings and calculate the embodied carbon of them in 7 hours, because we're not giving you extra time. because as an engineer, you'll all know that no client's going to pay you for this, and you just have to do it in between everything else. So we thought it was fair to replicate that in the exam. So yeah, as of next year, to become the equivalent of a professional engineer with us, you've got to be carbon literate. It's just a line in the sand. And I think in due course, we will be attacking continued professional developments. There'll be a requirement to do stuff like this every year for those who are already chartered. We've also now raised the bar for how we describe excellence in structural engineering. We shook our award scheme up last year, like completely. We no longer have awards that have phrases like tall buildings in their title. We weren't celebrating them for being tall, we were celebrating them for the technical excellence, but it's kind of about the messaging, and it was more about, how do we describe the job that we do? How do we talk to clients and talk to the outside world about what is good engineering? So we got rid of all of these categories. Projects now get described on their own merits. We have these 4 words beginning with P, which you'll recognize came from my sort of appraisal story from earlier on about the sort of work I used to like to do. So that had a bit of that sort of leaked out into this a little bit. We asked people to describe their projects in terms of impacts on one or more of those attributes. And we did this for the first time last year. And the breadth of projects we got in was amazing. So I had just as many like silly bonkers tool stuff as we had in the past, but we also had this far more sort of mature palette of loads of reuse projects from across the UK and Europe, and some really exciting stuff. The project's on the top right is called the Green School in Bali. It was designed by Atelier One with the structural engineers, and it's got a carbon footprint of 8 kilograms of carbon per square meter because it reuses the foundations and the ground slab from something else, and then it's built out of bamboo. And it's all derived with anti-clastic cells and stuff. So it's, even though they're using bamboo, and they could have thrown as much of it as they wanted because it grows next door to the school, they still thought they'd do it efficiently, which is why I say 8. So I'm not sure you can calculate that accurately, but it's very, very low. So yeah, some really, really cool stuff came out of that. And of course, we continue through all of this sort of raising standards and stuff. We continue to create guidance and help our members achieve those standards. So we've got courses on embodied carbon. We've got courses that go into depth on net zero structural design. We do all this stuff online now because most of our members are working remotely. They're mostly not based in London when you look at the stats. So we realize actually we should do this online. So we've got people all over the world dialing in. This course that we're currently running, current cohort for this, I think out of the 20 people, only 11 of them are based in the UK, which is really cool actually. So we've got a couple in the US and we've got a bunch in other parts of sort of Eastern Europe and so on. And we, basically, we're teaching people how do you go through taking efficient design, pairing it up with reimagining briefs, and using that as part of helping a client understand how to do low carbon structural engineering. And we're continuing to produce guidance and books like this. So this is our circular economy design guide that's coming out in June, and it's like 200 pages long, and it completely demystifies what on earth this circular economy catchphrase actually means. It teaches you how to reuse buildings. It teaches you how to reuse components from buildings. And it's got case studies of people doing both of those. And it teaches you how to design for future deconstruction and reuse. So it does the whole sort of spectrum of circular economy. So that's all the sort of internal stuff. At the same time as trying to change the way we work as an institution, we've also been trying to focus on helping the industry move on, because there's no point you getting so far ahead of the game that nobody wants your services, which is, unfortunately the case. You need to move the norm with you. So whilst we've been doing all of this, the rest of the industry in the UK has also been shifting in the same direction. The reuse and retrofit market in the UK has just gone through the roof in the last couple of years. Like in central London, reusing existing buildings has just become more and more popular. Developers who up until a couple of years ago would just knock everything down and start again if there was any slight inkling of a reason to do so, are now focusing on how do we reuse stuff, can we extend it, and so on. So there's a real sort of shift in the market, which is amazing, obviously. And carbon assessments becoming more normal. So actually, again, in central London, there's a planning requirement now that if your project's over a certain size, you have to submit a whole life carbon assessment and a circular economy statement as part of that. So it's it's really sort of shifting the dial as to what's the norm. And there's at least one other council that's brought in similar requirements in the last sort of month or so, and it's only going to spread. And alongside all that happening, because of the standards and the guidance and the public speaking and so on that we've been doing as an institution, we'd started to get a bit of a reputation for knowing about sustainability in this sort of space. And with that, we realized came a bit of a sort of responsibility to try and help force the change at an industry level that we can do something about. So I'm not talking about protests and gluing ourselves to roads and things like that. We try to remain a professional institution, but we did think that a bit of professional advocacy was probably required in terms of embodied carbon and regulation and limits. That image on the left is, believe it or not a real world front cover of a newspaper. That was from the presentation I gave in 2019 before I went on sabbatical, as something to try and get people in the room to consider how we could stand up as an institution and call on governments to introduce carbon regulation. Easy, why didn't we do it? Now that I was in the job, the chief exec was very quick to remind me that I'd done this and sort of set me going on making it happen. So actually, yeah, before I go into depth about it, things to say on this as well is we're talking about embodied carbon regulation. We're not talking about the sort of carbon factor side of things. So you guys have got a lot of like buy clean legislation happening all over different parts of the country, which is great. And we've got the equivalent happening in the UK on public projects as well, in terms of, you know, low carbon concretes and steels. But it's only half the equation, isn't there? We all know the other half on quantity of material is not only just as important, but you can actually do stuff with it a lot quicker. In the UK, these are the decarbonisation curves for the three key materials that have come out of the roadmaps published by the supply chains in the UK. And they're all saying about the same thing. I colour them all in grey deliberately because it's not about who's faster. It's about the fact they're all saying by 2030 they can knock about 20% off their emissions. And we know we need to get to 50%. So that leaves you with using less material and switching from a high carbon option to a low carbon option, putting the right material in the right place. So as an institution, we don't really care which of the two things you do, whether it's decarbonise materials or use less of them. But the point is you need that big picture, that whole equation to be regulated. So we've been campaigning now for about 2 years for embodied carbon regulation. So in 2021, I got hold of my sort of collaborators from the equivalent institutions for architects and building services and so on. And we sat down and we tried to sort of imagine what the future would look like if this stuff was regulated. And we just went out and basically we wrote the legislation and how it would look in the UK to have embodied carbon limited on building projects. We named it Part Z. And that's because in the building codes in the UK, there's Part A, which is basically thou shalt not fall down for the structural engineers. And there's all these other parts, letters. Part L, it deals with operational energy and has limits on that. And they go up to about S or T or something. We weren't quite sure what was next, so we just went with Z. It turns out it's catchier as well. And we wrote the bit on the left, that tiny screenshot that you definitely can't read. That's all the regulation has to say. It's really short. And the bit on the right, the sort of supporting document, 7 pages long. It's, you know, a fraction of the length of most of these supporting documents because we actually have the sort of codes and standards to do this in the UK. We're quite fortunate in that respect. It's just they're optional. So all this stuff does is sort of make it official. We wrote it and we thought we'd stick it on the internet and just see what the industry reaction was. For context, we were doing this at a time when other countries in Europe were starting to regulate this for real. So this is not from 2021 when we started the project. This has been updated recently. But you can see from this, there's a whole bunch of other European countries legislating on this topic. The pink blobs are when they bring in the requirement to report whole life carbon, and the blue stuff is when limits are then introduced or embodied. So we've got this in the sort of background, and we've proposed in Part Z something which just about sort of keeps pace with our neighbours. And we put this out to the industry to ask them what they thought. And obviously, in the first instance, we had to ring up a few firms and say, please, will you write us a statement supporting this? And within about 3 days of going live, we were just inundated with emails. How do we give you a statement of support? How do we put this on your website? And you'll have to trust me on this if you've never worked in the UK. There are some big name companies on here, firms with billion-dollar turnovers, international work portfolios. There's also firms on here with 2 employees that work out of a co-working space, or 1 employee working from the shed at the end of the garden. It's every corner of the industry has got behind this. There's 200 plus statements of support for this online. And all of those firms, regardless of size, basically seem to be saying the same thing to us. They're saying, we're trying to do this anyway. We're actually being hampered by a lack of regulation because every client wants something slightly different to the other client, and that's a bit of a pain. And so regulation would bring consistency. It would give us a level playing field against those like who aren't trying to act on this. It would help us achieve the ESG requirements that our shareholders are asking us to meet now. And obviously it would help our country decarbonise, which seems like quite a good thing. And they're all putting this in writing and very happy to put it on the internet, which wasn't the case before we started doing Part Z. And that was enough that we could then go and start speaking to people in government about this and say to them, look, you kind of need to take this seriously. The industry actually does want this, regardless of what your civil servants might be telling you. So since we got past the sort of 200 support point, we've had a member of parliament on the right and a lord from the House of Lords, that's the sort of upper house, if you like, both try and table legislation that's been debated in parliament to try and get the equivalent of Part Z into law. On both occasions, the government hasn't supported it due to wanting to do further research, blah, 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 blah. But this is a real turning point. I don't think MPs have been known to debate the A4 emissions benefit of locally produced steel in the Houses of Parliament before. Most of the people weren't excited by that, but I was like, yes, it's quite amazing. And as a result of this, the government department who look after those building codes now are doing real research and are running a consultation later this year on how they approach this topic. So it's a case of if, no, it's not. It's a case of when rather than if in terms of this regulation. And because the industry knows it's coming, the industry is acting as if it's already there in many parts. So people are just sort of getting behind this. People talk about Part Z as if it's a real thing, which we have to keep reminding the government department that we are not telling them that it's a real thing. And it's very clearly not real. It's just how they want to treat it. And then finally, whilst we do wait for that to come in, and this is the last bit of sort of action that we're trying to make happen, we've decided as an industry that we just get on with the closest thing we could find to producing regulation. So there's a bunch of 9 institutions like mine have got together and we're writing a standard for net zero carbon buildings. So it's a standard with a series of 1.5 degree aligned embodied and operational carbon limits in it, reporting requirements, ongoing verification requirements once the buildings are up and running. And we're due to launch the sort of beta of it sometime around the end of this year, early next year. This was meant to be a small briefing session at a conference I went to in March. The standing room was sort of 3 rows deep by the time we got going. The industry really, really wants this because this is a sort of placeholder until you get the regulation. And again, similarly to Part Z, because people know it's coming, people are sort of acting as if it's already here. This is a standard that will be voluntary, but it means that developers can specify it on their projects in the same way you can specify LEED Platinum. They can just say net zero in accordance with that standard. And design teams are wanting to know already, what do we have to learn how to do this year so we can comply with it as of January next year when the beta launches. So that's a really, really exciting thing to be part of. If you want to learn more about that, I should have put the website on here. I'll send it around afterwards. You guys, I can't even remember the website, so I will definitely send it around afterwards. So that's the sort of whistle-stop tour of the work we've been doing as an institution and the work that I've been doing over the last few years since moving into this space. I wanted to finish, hopefully, we do have time, good. I wanted to finish by sort of reflecting on all of that. I was asked when I came out, would I sort of speak about creating change and, how do we learn from that change that we've created? And actually pulling the next sort of 10 slides together has been something that I've really benefited from being able to do. Because we don't often sort of step back and review the work that we're doing, particularly in a space like this. It's so fast moving. There's so much in the diary the whole time that, you never find time to do something like this. So I'm really genuinely grateful to be asked to do this because it's meant that I can actually try and sort of learn from it ourselves. So first question, have we been successful? I hope the answer is yes. We did a survey recently and it showed a marked change in sort of experience levels between 2018 and 2020. 2, I think, across all the sorts of areas of sustainability you'd expect. There's still quite a lot of work to do in a lot of those areas, but they've all shifted the graph to the right. And so we're convinced that the answer to the first question is probably yes, fine. The interesting question, of course, is the second bit, right, the why. There's a few things on this, and these are kind of my opinion, but they're stuff that I've heard others say as well when we've talked about this in the past. So the first big why I think on this is to do with leadership. It's to do with being given the direction to do this coming from the top of the institution. So the chief exec at the time, we now on to our second chief exec since I started, which is not my fault. But Martin on the left, completely backed this idea. Once it was obvious to him that we had to act, he was saying, right, yeah, we need to get on with this directly. The board of trustees, council, chief exec, and therefore all of the staff who sit beneath the chief exec all bought into this idea that safety and sustainability from now on need to be treated as equal. This idea that really designing buildings sustainably is just a safety thing. It's just over a much longer time frame. They hired me as a full-time member of staff. They gave me a lofty sounding job title. I should say, by the way, there's no climate action department. It's just that we realized if they gave me a decent job title, people might listen when I stand up and speak. And it's really, really worked. But doing those sorts of things, having that leadership from the top and having everyone get behind this, it's added a sort of level of importance to the topic that you don't get if it sits as a sort of niche side subject. It basically, it sent a message to the membership and to the institution, membership and the wider industry, rather. As an institution, we were treating this really, really seriously now. This was going to be a sort of core tenet. And that's reflected then in the sort of hierarchy of how we treated all this. So this big organogram shows you how all of the different sort of volunteer groups within the institution work. So the stuff in green are members of staff, and the stuff in purple are members doing various panels. You'll see that there's a sustainability panel near the bottom, which has sat there for a long time. They've been trying to create this change, and they've been pushing and pushing these bulls going uphill for a very long time, trying to get people to listen. And they will be there long after we've gone, in terms of me and the task group that I work with. But in terms of setting up, my job, you'll see I'm sort of top left feeding into the chief exec. And underneath me, we've got that climate emergency task group that I mentioned that Mike Cook was setting up when I just landed back in rural Leicestershire. And the task group was asked to feed in at the sort of top tier so that it could work across departments and help create change across everything the institution did, rather than having to feed in through others. So again, this is about, putting the topic on a level of importance that, aligns with the true nature of the sort of climate emergency, if you like. Along with importance, I think we've treated the topic really consistently. So as of that June 2020 issue, like I say, every single issue of our magazine has had this at its heart. This is a selection of front covers since then. It's just everywhere. And for the first sort of year and a half, we had these standalone climate change pages within the magazine. We transitioned away from that towards the end of 2021. And as of the start of last year, we'd got to the point with the editor where we were just able to make sure that this was inherent in everything that was published. So for the last year and 4 months, we haven't had a climate emergency section, but you open the magazine and it's clearly just a part of the everyday job of the engineer now. And that sort of consistency around talking about this has just sent that message of, this is your job, everyone else is doing it, you need to do it as well. Sort of changing the norm. And that consistency is extended, like I say, through the awards. This is, just a random young members group LinkedIn post I found. They're doing these evening talks on zero carbon concretes and all this stuff that, again, would have been the realm of the sort of sustainability people a few years ago, but now is very much a core topic. Our entire suite of conferences and CPD courses, these are all embedding this stuff within as well. And it doesn't mean to say that when we run a deep basements training course, we now have, a dedicated bit on calculating carbon on there, but we do expect the trainer to go away and understand the sort of impact of what they're talking about and be prepared and be able to, at the very least, answer questions on it and understand why we probably shouldn't be building too many deep basements right now. So it really has become sort of everywhere. And I think we've supported that by some really sort of, I guess, messaging that's focused at the sort of normal engineer. This was, part of trying to make this the norm was always about how do you speak to the person who actually just needs to get their drawings out the door, the photocopier doesn't work, and they've got to write 2 bid documents by the end of the week alongside issuing some construction documentation. Oh, and the contractor's on the phone because the building's being built facing the wrong way and that kind of thing, right? That core membership, most of whom are worrying about a lot of other things right now, how do you speak to them? And so a lot of the messaging was around the sort of, really practical business side of this rather than just the sort of emotional tugging on the heartstrings sort of stuff. Not to say there wasn't any of that. You'll notice the bit at the bottom very much is get on with it or your kids will hate you. But, you had to get the balance right. And like I said before, we were clear that we were going to construct the whole picture as an institution. This was not about sort of waiting for materials to decarbonize. This was not somebody else's problem. There are things you can do as an engineer. We're in the middle now of writing some sort of materials notes that try and help the engineers understand how they can help the bit where you decarbonize concrete and steel. But fundamentally, the core message is still the same. You need to use less stuff and you need to put the right material in the right place. Stuff you can control as an engineer, get on with it. And I think members have heard that. And we supported that with, these diagrams and these tools and this training and all that sort of stuff, so that, in the hope that they feel like they sort of know where to start with this stuff. And last but not least, we wouldn't have done this without this massive pool of people dedicating time in their evenings and their weekends to creating stuff for us. But like I say, when I started this job, I really didn't know very much about this topic at all. But it didn't matter because my job wasn't to write guidance. My job was to find out who knew about this stuff and give them the platform so that people would listen to them. And my job was basically to big them up and make everyone else think that they were brilliant, so that when they stood up and opened their mouths, everyone was ready to listen, ready to write loads of notes and go back to their office. Oh, you missed this talk. And we've had literally hundreds of people volunteer time for us. We've quite often, I've gone to somebody, usually told them that theirs is the only topic that matters to us this week or hour, or whatever. Could they please do this one thing? And could they do it in quite a tight time frame? Would that be okay? And they've always said yes. And then quite often with those people, I've not gone back to them and asked them for anything else, unless they've really wanted it. We've sort of relied on the fact that there's enough people out there wanting to do this stuff that we don't have to keep taking people's time up. We can go back to them and say, do you know anyone else who knows about it? You wrote something on reusing foundations. Do you know anyone who knows about other sort of substructure type stuff? And they'd give you a list of names and you ring them up. But it's really, I think it's helped kind of for two things. One, it's meant that people haven't got fatigued. And two, it's created this quite large community of people who feel like they are giving time and buying into this movement. And obviously with each of them, they spread the word to others. You send them the magazine in the post that they helped write an article for. They get excited. They give copies to their colleagues and that kind of thing. And it's helped things kind of grow organically. And I think, the other thing on this is that it's kind of enabled us to be a bit more reactive as well. So we haven't had to plan all this stuff a long way in advance. When we realized that actually we wanted to do something about the regulation side of things, I just went out and found who would be the best people to help me do it. And we just got on with that in our little circle. And meanwhile, there are some other people writing about circular economy stuff and some other people setting up a conference for later in the year to do some, lean design type learning and stuff like that. We could sort of, just as stuff came up, get on with it. Again, you can't do it if you try and organize this too much. When I started, I remember saying to Mike Cook that I kind of wanted us to like orchestrate all of this. And he said, no, you're using the wrong metaphor. This is not an orchestra. You're not a conductor. This is like a ceilidh or a barn dance where everyone's kind of sweaty and a bit drunk and sort of doing the same thing and moving in the same sort of direction. And that's good enough. So embrace that. So we have. And I think that it's that sort of combination of, leadership, importance, consistency, clarity of messaging, and empowering all those people. That's what's, to me, at least, that's what's sort of creating the change. And that's what's enabled us to deliver all that guidance, to change our standards, to change the awards, to go out and campaign for this sort of stuff. And I very much feel like we're not done yet. And I feel like there's a lot of enthusiasm still out there and there's a lot more still to come. And with that, thank you very much. I think we've got 10 minutes for some questions, if people want. Oh, before we ask questions, I actually have a request as well. I was sat in Heathrow Airport yesterday afternoon, feeling quite angsty about getting on a flight, having decided only sort of 9 months before that I wasn't going to set foot on a plane ever again, because I went, long story. And I posted about this on LinkedIn to sort of see what other people said, which firstly, I got so many comments came back really quickly that it made me realize, everyone else worries about this too. That's good. And somebody had this brilliant idea. They said, well, you just need to go around and get everyone to pledge to reduce their work by enough carbon tomorrow to make it worthwhile. So the request bit is that I'm going to emit 2 tons of carbon by coming over to the US and going back. So could you all please make sure that when you go to work tomorrow, you just find 2 tons of carbon in your work and get rid of it. It's only 2 tons. It's like nothing, right? Shave 2 millimeters off the thickness of a concrete slab or something. And if you all do that, then I can go home and feel guilt-free. Yeah, thank you. Good. Okay. How do you want to do Q&A? Do we have a mic?
So, yeah,